Howdy, welcome to today's Sierra Forum. I'm the editor-in-chief of magazine, and I normally host these forums, which is not club members to hear about the work that we and our partners now across the country to protect clean air, clean water, a stable and wild nature. If you've got any conversation, you're joining us by Zoom, you can always draw a question into the chat box if you're joining us on Facebook Live. And we will try to get your questions. We'll do about minutes of conversation among today's lists, and then we'll have questions, plenty of time, comments and reflections from. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm from what traditionally was land before Europeans showed. The shores of the Bay Area were inhabited by the Ohlone people, and there are many Ohlone people who live here today. And that's an important acknowledgement to take, I think, all the time, but especially for today's conversation, which is on the action and the collaboration between environmental groups like the Sierra Club and Native American nations. Many of you might remember that it was just about exactly 2 years ago when the struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline grabbed headlines. On Labor Day weekend 2016, Amy Good from Democracy Now! Broadcast stunning and outrageous footage of women, children, people of all praying to stop a vast oil pipeline when they were set upon by North Dakota and corporate security forces, used dogs and other forms of violence to attack them. In the following months, of course, thousands of people converged on the water protectors camp at this Sioux Nation. Unfortunately, not long after that, the newly elected Trump greenlighted the pipeline, but the water protectors' effort of similar efforts and sort of had a spark of inspiration. And what we'll be talking about today is, what does the Native American-led environmental activism say? What other frontline struggles are taking place, and how can non-Native folks best be in solidarity with those efforts? I'm really excited to have folks here today to talk about that. First is Tara Hauska. Hi, Tara. She is a member of the Ojibwe from the Cochin-Ching First Nation, and she's the National Campaigns Director for Honor the Earth. Lena Moffat directs the Sierra Club's Our Wild America campaign, and Seisha Kearns is the Deputy Regional Director with the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign. I also want to say that we invited Jay Julius, who is the chair of the Lummi Nation, a Coast Salish nation there in the Pacific Northwest. And unfortunately, Chairman Julius was not able to join us because he and some other tribal members are today out on the shores, out on the waters of the Salish Sea, trying to help feed a starving and distressed orca pod there in the Salish Sea. So Tara, I'd love to start with you. I think many people listening, they're probably aware and remember the Dakota Access campaign and the water protectors camp there. But I'd love it if you could bring us up to date, talk about some of the other ongoing Native-led environmental campaigns that are underway right now.
Sure, and I have to apologize for the quality of the signal here. I'm actually calling in from Park Rapids, Minnesota, at a grocery store. So that is, we don't have Wi-Fi yet at our resistance camp. So can't hear me, I'm sorry. Some of the struggles that are happening across Turtle Island include the Kinder Morgan resistance. As I'm sure so many folks saw, Justin Trudeau actually decided to buy outright the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Like the government is openly buying pipelines now on the Canadian side of the border in so-called Canada. And there is a massive resistance to that, and it's been ongoing for a number of months and also years for some of these folks. I mean, we have like the tiny home warriors led by Conejos Manuel and others who are building homes in the path of the pipeline on their traditional territory. There were all of these, direct actions that happened at the inlets to try and stop and blockade the ships from coming in to the ports. It's been a very long resistance there. There are folks that are continuing to resist the Bayou Bridge pipeline. That's actually one that's tied to Energy Transfer Partners. So, the Dakota Access Pipeline, Energy Transfer Partners is the company behind it. Now down in Louisiana, there's been this extended struggle, and they're in the last, the last call outs of please come help us because it is dire. The situation is dire. Just last week, we saw 2 activists that were arrested out of their kayaks on a public waterway and they're currently being charged under the new ALEC laws. So that's ALEC, the laws where it basically criminalizes and creates felonies for any type of protest involving critical infrastructure, which would be pipelines. And they pushed those bills all over the country. They actually tried it here in Minnesota because they knew about the resistance to Line 3, the pipeline I'm fighting, and many others are. But it didn't pass here. It passed in Louisiana, so we're all kind of watching to see what happens with that. There are resistance struggles happening around Bears Ears. It is a sacred site that was taken out of protection, federal protection, by the Trump administration. There are ongoing resistance to LNG terminals, to the Mountain Valley Pipeline, to so many different struggles across the country. Standing Rock, I think, kind of lit this fire that's been transported around the world.
And Tara, I'm wondering if
and I'd be remiss too to not mention Mauna Kea. I have to mention Mauna Kea. Our Hawaiian relatives have been fighting to protect the mountain for a very long time.
And right, the proposal there, I believe, is to build a giant telescope on the top of that sacred mountain.
It is.
Tara, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, all of those things you mentioned that are obviously about protecting clean air, clean water, about, guaranteeing just public health and safety. And would probably be kind of thought of by many people as sort of environmental struggles, but often there's real other kind of human rights impacts here. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and perhaps also raise the issue, which we've covered here at Sierra Magazine, the Sierra Club has been attuned to, which is often the violence we see, especially violence against women, and especially violence against First Nations women, that often accompanies resource extraction, whether that's the man camps in the North Dakota Bakken fields, or mining adjacent to Canadian First Nations, et cetera. And also talk about some of the other human rights violations we see that accompany these extractive industries.
Yeah, I'm sure many of us are aware that the state of Indian country is not one that's been a great one since the beginning of the United States. So you're kind of coming into communities that have been systematically removed of land holdings, of economic opportunity, of so many different aspects of life that, most Americans don't even think of. Like jurisdictional issues over something like, if someone commits a violent crime or a rape on a reservation, we still don't have full jurisdiction to prosecute those crimes. There's nowhere else in the United States that's like that, and there's no other people that are treated like that. And we're in fixes for the consistent by our legislative bodies, things that involve basically not, which are the supreme laws of this land. The United States signed these agreements, these contracts with tribal nations, with certain guarantees and certain respects of sovereignty and nationhood. That is one issue in itself. So when you look at an infrastructure project, like a pipeline or a mine or those aren't even infrastructure, they're infrastructure for those guys, for the industry. But when you look at something like that, it happens in places that are out of sight, out of mind. It happens in places like Indian country. It happens in places like these farmers that are resisting in Nebraska. It happens in places people don't think about. And with an indigenous community, you're often coming into a community that is already poverty stricken, that is already struggling to get by, that already has all these health issues and health impacts. In addition to having, abysmal education situations, abysmal, opportunity. So it's like adding insult to injury on top of a community that has already been stripped of so many different things, and is struggling to literally survive. But then, by the way, we're actually going to put this, project right next to your drinking water too. So it's like kind of coming for the last pieces of what tribal nations are. And in the context of what actually happens when these projects come in, someone has to build these things. Someone has to dig the mine. Someone has to build the fracking well. Somebody has to run the oil rig. Somebody has to put the pipeline into the ground. And that oftentimes leads to these things called man camps, these, influxes of thousands of workers to get a job done into the middle of nowhere. And where do they go? They go, what's nearby? And what's nearby? It's a small reservation or an Indian population. And crime dramatically goes up when those move next to our communities. I was going to say there's this missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's on a movement of people because of the level of violence that we experience as a result.
And Tara, I'm so glad you brought up the question. I think we'll come back to it later in the conversation about sovereignty. I think it's a lot of non-native or Anglo people in this country to forget that Native nations are sovereign. If you look at the U.S., right, the language there around U.S. government's relation with Indian, as it says in the Constitution, Indian nations are supposed to be affairs, and it's so easily forgotten. I just want to remind folks, again, if you have any questions, you're on Zoom, you can put it in the Q&A chat box. If you're on Facebook, just put it there in the comments field. Lena, I'd love to hear from you. You know, I think it's fair to say that the Sierra Club has sometimes had a fraught relationship with Native nations. And I want to talk about the work that's been done recently to rebuild trust and to maybe to explain, you know, what the Sierra Club did either in the Dakota Access fight or some of these other struggles that relationship of solidarity with Native campaigners.
Sure. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And my name's Lena Moffett. I direct the Sierra Club's Our Wild America campaign, where we're working to protect public lands, keep fossil fuels in the ground, and get more people outside. I wanted to share, I'm also joining from Washington, D.C., which was originally inhabited by Piscataway people. I grew up in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, land originally occupied by the Sandia Pueblo people and the Isleta Pueblo people, many of whom still live there. So I think that's an important recognition of history, which is something that we need to do more consistently. And I'm really proud that the Sierra Club has been making a move over the past decade or so to recognize our troubled past. And I think more broadly, the troubled history of the environmental movement in the United States, especially when it comes to land protection. The conservation movement, so to speak, was really born out of, yes, a desire to protect beautiful places that folks loved, but that was often land where Native Americans were living. And the conservation ethos was born out of that injustice often. And I think we need to recognize that first and foremost. In my time at the Sierra Club, I've been so, I think, lucky, and I feel very proud to have helped us acknowledge that past and build relationships with Native leaders on so many of these fights. Hi, Tara. It's so exciting to see you. I think the last time I saw you was when we were out at camp during the Standing Rock fight. And I get to form relationships with leaders like Tara, who are just so incredibly inspiring and tireless and generous to work with us. And we do that work by acting with integrity and honesty and transparency and being diligent and kind. I think we have to share what we can do and not overpromise, and then also be there for the long haul. At the Sierra Club, we're really trying to live the Jemez principles and, you know, make sure that folks are speaking for themselves and that we are working with communities from the bottom up and not coming in with a pre-baked idea about how to do things. And forming relationships with those principles in mind has really helped. And I'm so excited we've gotten to work together on many of those fights that Tara mentioned, where we're working in solidarity, but first and foremost, we respect sovereignty first. If tribal leaders want to come to us and ask for assistance, I've been proud to be able to say yes so many times with our work and partnerships around the country. But really, it's deferring to leadership of folks who are the most impacted, and then trying to do that work with diligence and honesty and kindness.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Lena. I really appreciate it. Seish, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that actually played out on the ground, or as the case may be, on the ground and the waters there on the coast, the shorelines of the Salish Sea, proposals for a number of mega coal export terminals there outside of Bellingham, Washington. And the Sierra Club worked very closely with the Lummi Nation, again, a coast Salish nation there in Bellingham, and what that looked like. And also if you could talk, you know, really candidly about the challenges of a big group like the Sierra Club stepping and taking leadership from.
I'd be happy to. Thank you all for joining today. It's great to be here, and I want to take a moment to also. Right now, I'm where I'm at, and so I just want to acknowledge the history of the Denver region where I'm at now, and Colorado which has a history of the Southern Ute Indian tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. The land that Denver sits originally belonged to the tribe, as was laid out in the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And there's other indigenous nations that are connected to the area, including the Apache, Comanche, Shoshone. And I have Chairman Julius from the Lummi Nation joining us today, but as Jason mentioned, out with other leaders doing what is most and present for them right now, being out on the Salish Sea connected to Save the Blackfish and Orca. We hope to share more information about their later on in our discussion today. To your question, there's come with learning an organization like this and other traditional environmental organizations working with Native nations. And you know, I'm not by any means, and I'm not speaking on behalf of me or any tribal leader, but I do observations about our partnership and on this coal export terminal. And what I see as truly acts of capacity from the Legion and other Coast Salish tribes to help us, frankly, learn about our own content and our obligations under that. And a growing recognition from the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations about what we have often failed to see in terms of the history. So we can better show up as organizations that are a resource to do this, and kind of the unique differences between them. And so through our work with the Lummi Nation, this was centered around a coal terminal that Jason referenced. It was going to be the largest proposed coal export terminal in North America. 48 million tons of coal a year. That would have added 30 miles of coal trains a day coming through the Northwest and along the Salish Sea. It would have added enormous vessel traffic to an already strained waterway that impacts both the whales and the water quality. There could have been some very severe impacts to fishing there, which was part of the concern for the Lummi Nation and being involved with this. And I'm happy to say that that terminal was the proposed, thanks to the leadership of the Nation and many other organizations and communities that were rising up to say that we wanted something different in the Northwest. And I think one of the main things that we, the Sierra Club working through this and with our other environmental is thinking about how we can step out of what our what I might say our muscle memory or what we're kind of normally trained to do as professional advocates. We think in terms of how are we trying to get our narrative out and our message across, trying to move people, decision makers, and those are also similar approaches and tactics that the tribe are using for us to really reflex as an environmental organization to try to get something out in the press right. That was one very explicit way of learning that we wanted to make. We were not speaking on behalf of tribe's perspective on this. So trying to our connections with reporters for people to say, if you had when you should contact with the Lummi Nation, for example, and to really let the tribe stand back and not try to take the airspace. Discussion of the impacts of the terminal and the decision ultimately of the permitting the terminal, which was at the heart of the victory there. That came down to the treaty rights that the Lummi Nation put on the line. It ended up benefiting people from coal mine to as a result. One of the are you gonna
No, go ahead, sorry.
That sense of openness to learning, considering facts that maybe we hadn't considered before, the depth of the in terms of proportionate and unique impacts that this project would have on the Lummi Nation that were different for other people who are non-native living near there. And that's in deference to their impacts on their ancestral lands, the sacredness of the water and the place, and the importance of their treaty fishing rights that are a different level of importance and impact necessarily.
Thank you so much for for sharing all that history there, Seisha. I'd love to hear from you and maybe some reflections on that. It is important that the Sierra Club, as Seisha was saying, is sort of some old reflexes showing sensitivity and intentionality. I can't imagine roses all the time, and I'd really like Tara to think of this as a safe space that we're having with our supporters here. What are challenges? I mean, even though we are seeing maybe an evolution in environmental, largely white environments and Native nations, there still must be some tensions and challenges. I'm wondering what you think are sort of the next steps in evolutions and the next steps in learning.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that there have been some strides made from a lot of different organizations, and some more than others for sure. In terms of actually having Indigenous leadership at the table and not kind of more like in photographs, role in direct, amount of good in that particular area. Like it was, okay, we're asking you all to kind of just support and step back and let us do this. And it kind of, I think, or forced the environmental community to kind of wake up and realize, hey, we can actually do these things. And when we're involved in these things, it actually is very, very successful. Divestment would be another example. Divestment's a campaign that's been going on for decades. The intention from Standing Rock and the Indigenous leadership there and the human rights violations that happened there, you have Indigenous peoples now going all over the impacts. That shows, and now we're seeing this kind of like steady, click by click of all these different banks saying, actually, we're thinking about pulling out of this. We're thinking about pulling out of this. In terms of challenges, I think that we're still, it's not like we just flipped on a switch and it's all good now and everyone is peoples. No, that's not enough to just say these things. We actually have to do these things. Organizations are still largely, I would say, a particular demographic. In my opinion, there's very few Indigenous peoples that are represented in, the mainstream so-called big greens. I think they're making efforts on that, but it should be a lot more than, I hope to see more. I hope to see more campaigners hired. I hope to see more, higher level positions of Indigenous leadership. I would also say, I think the ongoing problem of not just Indigenous people, but just frontlines communities around the country is we're still kind of in this top-down model. And, I'm sitting here in a resistance camp in Minnesota defending my people's territory, Anishinaabe territory, writing grant applications for like $1,000, $500, $3,000, and having to spend hours and hours and hours doing these things to fund people that are literally trying to stop a massive tar sands project, and having to spend, entire days doing that. And of course we will do it, but it's a top-down model of funding where a lot of the larger organizations continue to hold most of the resources while the front lines are struggling. But yeah, I think, I do think that people are making concerted efforts to try to change that and move away from that old model because, we need to win. The situation is dire. We don't have time to continue to do the status quo anymore. Even as the environmental movement, I think that we've come a long way, but listening to the people who have been taking care of the earth since, time immemorial, listening to the people who hold 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. Indigenous peoples hold 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity for a reason. We know what stewardship is, and so, our ideas should be listened to and respected.
So much, Tara, for that honesty and that candor there. I really appreciate it. We're going to go straight to some audience questions. Again, if you're on Zoom, just put your comment there in the Q&A chat. And if you're on Facebook, put it there in the chat and it'll get forwarded over to us. So we've got a question here, and I'd love to hear this is for any three of you, from Benjamin. Benjamin says, and this is a question we also got in advance, how would you encourage someone listening and watching this webinar to help through action with tribal lands and people? So I'm guessing this is, again, probably a non-native questioner, again, sort of wondering how actually in practice could they contribute to these others?
It looks like Tara may have hit an internet bump for a minute, but I'm happy to take a crack at that. And then Seisha, please jump in. First and foremost, I would say learn about the history of your region. I think it's critical to acknowledge the context that you are living in, and often you'll be living amongst Native communities and they will have very specific asks and needs right there where you are. Second, many of the things that we are fighting back against right now at the Sierra Club, against the Trump administration, are also priorities for many of our Native American allies. In particular, I'm seeing on our Wild America work, a lot of the lands work where we are fighting back against the Secretary of the Interior, Zinke. His priorities are to just open up all of our public lands to the oil and gas industry and to extractive industries. That is clearly his priority. And that includes a lot of places that many of the tribes of the United States hold sacred. Tara mentioned Bears Ears. That is one of 2 national monuments that Trump and Zinke, in an unprecedented move, downgraded the protection, and they shrank the Bears Ears National Monument by 85%. And that is a place that is held sacred by many of the tribes in the region. It was the first national monument to be designed and pushed for by tribal nations, including the Navajo Nation from Utah, who led the charge on that. And that was a place where we took a back seat and supported them in getting Obama to designate that national monument. And now we're standing right alongside them to defend it. If you want to sign up for some of our action alerts where you can send in a comment and ask them not to attack these sacred places, you can go to sc.org/publiclands and sign up for our list, where we're going to be sending a request for individualized comments on Bears Ears actually very soon. We're sending one tomorrow. There's a comment period open on Bears Ears. Similarly, with other places around the country, Chaco Canyon is a sacred place in New Mexico where we're working very closely with the Navajo Nation and all 19 Pueblo nations in New Mexico to protect that place from fracking. And potentially, Zinke is going to open it up again for fracking right by the most sacred sites later this year. We'll be sending a request for you to send in your comments and help us make noise and showcase the public backlash that we want to keep those lands protected and stand with our tribal allies, and helping us make that noise and send in comments and go to rallies when we have them, write letters to the editor is critically important. We're seeing Zinke respond sometimes to pleas like that, and we could really use your help.
Great. Well, maybe I'll chime in when we get Tara back. Hand it over to her. As we've mentioned already, and as Lena noted beautifully, we have a growing edge at the Sierra Club in how we're showing up and being deferential regarding sovereignty, and we have a lot to learn from the past. And so absolutely try to get to know the history of where you live, the history of Indigenous people around the country that we live in now, and try to ask maybe a little bit of an abstract question around what does it mean to confront the impacts of colonization today. And by doing that, we can all, as non-Native people like myself, need to develop this deeper understanding of the significance of the unique authority and risks and cultural perspectives that tribal leaders bear when they engage in environmental advocacy, and specifically in regulatory decisions. There's a different kind of risk that happens. And to the extent that we can figure out how to best show up in that, that's a powerful thing. And so for individuals, I think getting a sense of what does that look like in the community that you're in? How can our cultural and moral and historic obligation to respect tribal communities play out where you live? And as an individual, how could you show up in that, either through the Sierra Club and our partnerships with tribal communities, or in some other way? And I think one illustration of that I can think of, just building on the partnership we've had with the Lummi Nation, is there's a traditional leader in Carver, Jewel James, who created these beautiful totem poles, and as part of the fight on the Cherry Point coal export terminal, took this totem pole out to the coal fields where the coal would be mined from, and made stops all along the way with this totem pole. It's called the Totem Pole Journey. You can Google it. There's been several of them since that time, to bring both spiritual context and a very clear call to action around what people could do. And as those events happened, the role of the Sierra Club was really helping to connect in with the folks that we had and with the networks in the places where those stops were happening, and to support it from behind the scenes. But those stops were a really powerful learning opportunity and community building opportunity, as well as an action opportunity. And so you could look to where are there public events where non-Native people are being invited to come and learn and to take action on whatever might be happening in a given place around a particular fight or advocacy action that's happening. So that's a few things to think about. Another avenue is, again, connecting back to the impacts on the Salish Sea with the Lummi Nation. One of the ways that we're looking at moving through that is, we didn't want to just leave when the coal terminal fight was over. Then there was an oil terminal proposal that came in. There's other projects that are being proposed. And so we've continued to try to stay in dialogue, be engaged there, and try to build a deeper understanding between Sierra Club and non-Native and the Lummi Nation specifically. So one thing you could look at is just supporting their efforts, and you go to the website sacredsea.org, and that can tell you more about what is most present for them right now. It's just a few thoughts.
I'm glad we got Tara back again. Tara Hauska from Honor the Earth is speaking to us from a resistance camp where she and others are in opposition to the Line 3 pipeline from Enbridge. Tara, there's a couple questions here I'd love you to field. And one is, I think it's kind of interesting here from one named Gail, is I'm wondering if you explain what advice might sound obvious. Skeptics, maybe it's not. And I do think that's maybe an important thing to sort of tease out. How would you sort of explain the idea of sacred lands to a non-Indigenous audience? Or how could Gail explain it to her friends and neighbors and family?
Sure. And I literally just, since I'm sitting in this coffee shop, or actually coffee shop in a grocery store, just sent off a couple folks who are going to face the court systems for stopping Enbridge's Line 3 in protests that happened in November of last year. So it is happening. So as far as something that, sacred, I think, sometimes I hear things like, oh, well, to natives, everything is sacred. Like you can just say like that rock over there is sacred, like that tree is sacred. Yeah, of course. I mean, in the concept of like the world and being and, the circle of life as we know it, of course, there's all these sacred pieces to it. But when we talk about sacred lands and sacred sites, those are specific things. Those are things that are, this is somebody's burial site. This is somebody's part of their creation story. This is where our people have fasted for thousands of years. It's a specific area with specific meaning. This is where our people have sun danced for generations and generations. I mean, when I talk about like the places that, my people consider sacred, we're talking about lands that, our people have lived and died on for thousands of years, with specific areas that actually have very specific meanings. When I go fasting, I fast on a specific island, that's across from an island that looks exactly like a turtle. There have been generations of my family and our tribal people that have been out in those places. We've been fasting in that place on the lake, that bay of the lake, for thousands of years. So it's not just, okay, everything is sacred. These are places that have very specific meanings, that have very specific historical significance. And it's not just, I think one thing that people get hung up on is when a burial site or when a sacred site or when, something like this is lost. So, when Dakota Access decides to bulldoze through a sacred site, Rock Tribe is not the only people that are losing that. Native people are not the only people losing that. Everyone loses that. That's a part of all of our collective. So these losses should be felt by all of us.
Thank you so much for that, Tara. That was really illustrative, I hope, for the listeners. I want to toss out what I think is a hard... Tara, you still there? Make sure. Uh-oh. Looks like we lost Tara again. So, folks, I think we're probably going to wrap up here in a minute. Hopefully, Tara Haskell will be able to join us again. Tara is there, again, speaking to us from a resistance camp in Minnesota where Anishinaabe and other folks are fighting a proposed oil pipeline. I guess one last question, and I think you already kind of hit this, Seisha, about what specifically people can do. But this question here, sorry, just trying to find it. I think Paul asked about, what's kind of the long-term culture change work that needs to happen here, not just in the short term, but in the longer term to really link these folks. Oh, Tara's back. Tara, can I ask you to answer a question? No, it's okay. We understand. Tara, can you hear me?
Hey, Jason, while we're waiting for Tara's internet to come back, if I could just put one more.
I can hear you, sort of.
Great. If you can hear us, it's okay if we can't see you. Sort of. One question for you, Tara, and I know this is a challenging one, but a couple people asked about this. How to manage or what it looks like when there may be divisions within a Native community, say around, for example, the Navajo generating station, a major coal-fired power plant on the Navajo Nation, or say mining in Montana. Were you able to get that? I think Lena and Tara, why don't we give you the last, Lena, for closing thoughts for our audience?
Well, amplify one of the campaigns that Tara has been working on, and this came from a call Chairman Arsham Standing Rock as the Dakota fight was its peak, when it looked like Trump was going to approve that permanent administrative process wasn't work for us anymore. He put out a for folks to go to the banks, target the financial institutions backing these projects. So one request we have for you all, this is something we've been working with leaders like Tara on, is divestment. If you have stocks, significant stocks in a bank, or if you are a significant holder in a mutual fund, call that mutual fund advisor and tell them that you don't want that fund to be backing projects, tar sands pipelines, or call the investor relations person that you with at another bank and tell them that financing projects like N3 tar sands pipeline or XL, the Arctic sands and Arctic oil is just and pressure investors and owners on that side of the world and go to the corporations that are backing those projects is a good way to bring the pressure back and wants to chime in on
that. The audio off the video. Okay. If looking for specific actions to do, please support the front lines. Please look into the Lower Libby camp in Louisiana, the Bayou Bridge pipe, to the fight that I'm currently Stop Line 3, Enbridge's Line 3. Learn more at stopline3.org. And yes, divestment is a huge piece of this. So please look at Mazaska Talks, MAZASKA Talks.org. That is the Indigenous-led organization that has been targeting banks to the tune of, literally millions and millions of dollars in Seattle, in San Francisco, and, our efforts have been taken around the world.
Well, Tara, thank you so much for that. Thank you to you, Lena, and you, Seisha, for your time today. And thank you to all of us for joining us either by Zoom or by Facebook. Again, thanks for your patience with the technical difficulties. I think this is one of the challenges of working front lines. Literally this morning to, drive as fast as she could to get to some place connection. And it's just an example of really the kind of barriers that exist sometimes on this front lines work. If you want to learn more about this, we got a lot of URLs there from Tara and others. You can always go to also the website of Tara's organization. That's honorearth.org. Go to sierraclub.org. We're online all the time there, as well as on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other usual places. So much for your time today, for your attention, and for continuing all the good work that you do. We'll catch you at the next Sierra Forum. Thank you.